You might want to check your camera before you accuse me, officer." The words landed calm, almost quiet, but they cut through the humid night air like a blade as the red and blue lights painted the street in restless pulses, and Officer Daniel Reeves paused for half a second, just enough to feel something shift before he forced a tight smile back onto his face. The kind that didn't reach his eyes, the kind built from years of believing he was always in control, always right, always the one holding the story together. And he leaned slightly toward the open car door, gesturing inside like he had already written the ending. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said, voice steady, practiced, as if this moment was routine, as if the small, clear bag resting on the passenger seat hadn't appeared there just minutes ago by his own hand. But Olivia Carter stepped out slowly, heels touching pavement with quiet precision, her posture straight, her face unreadable, and she didn't look at the bag, didn't look at the crowd beginning to gather, didn't even look at the flashing lights. She looked directly at the lens mounted above the dashboard, the small black eye that blinked red, recording everything, capturing every second. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single point, that silent witness, as whispers rose around them. Phones lifted, screens glowing, strangers leaning closer for a better view of the fall of someone they thought untouchable, a federal judge in cuffs. A headline forming in real time, and Reeves cleared his throat, shifting his weight, the faint creak of his duty belt breaking the stillness. "You're under investigation for possession," he continued, each word measured, each syllable placed like a brick in a wall he believed would never crack. But Olivia didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't plead. Her hands moved forward without hesitation, wrists aligning as if she had rehearsed this moment in a different way, a deeper way. And the metal clicked shut with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. Sharp and final, yet something in her eyes didn't match the scene. There was no panic, no confusion, only a quiet awareness, like she was watching a story unfold that she already understood, and Reeves noticed it, just for a flicker, a discomfort he couldn't name pressing against his certainty. But he pushed it aside, guiding her toward the back seat as the murmurs grew louder, as someone whispered her name, as someone else said, "That's her, the judge," and the air thickened with disbelief, with curiosity, with the hunger for a downfall. But Olivia lowered herself into the seat without a word, the door closing behind her with a hollow thud, sealing the moment, sealing the narrative that had just begun. And as the engine idled and the lights continued to spin, she lifted her gaze once more, not to Reeves, not to the crowd, but to the camera again, steady, unblinking, as if it were the only thing that mattered, as if it were the one place truth couldn't be rewritten, and somewhere deep in the quiet space between breaths, before anyone else realized it, before the reports were filed or the headlines published, before the story spread beyond that street. Something had already begun to turn, something Reeves couldn't see yet, couldn't control, couldn't stop, and the night held its breath without knowing why. The patrol car door shut with a dull, sealed sound that lingered longer than it should have as the engine hummed beneath it, steady and indifferent, and Olivia Carter sat motionless in the back seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap, the cool metal around her wrists catching faint reflections of the passing streetlights while outside the gathered crowd began to thin, their voices fading into fragments of speculation and disbelief. And Officer Daniel Reeves circled around to the driver's side, his boots scraping lightly against the asphalt, each step controlled, deliberate, as if he were rehearsing confidence with every movement. Yet his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he glanced through the rearview mirror and saw her again, not broken, not shaken, but composed, watching, always watching. And he slid into his seat, adjusting his radio with a quick flick of his fingers, the static crackling briefly before settling into silence. "Dispatch. I have one in custody," he said. Voice clipped and professional, but the words felt heavier now, like they carried something more than procedure. And as he pulled the car into motion, the city lights stretched into blurred lines across the windshield, neon and amber blending into a restless glow that reflected faintly across Olivia's face, highlighting the stillness in her expression. And she shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but intention, her gaze drifting once more toward the small camera mounted at the front, the red indicator still blinking, steady, patient, recording every mile, every breath, every unspoken tension filling the space between them. And Reeves noticed again that look, that quiet certainty that did not belong in the back seat of a patrol car, and it unsettled him in a way he could not explain, a subtle pressure building behind his thoughts. But he pushed forward, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as the road curved toward the precinct, the familiar route offering a sense of control he needed to hold on to. And the silence stretched, thick and deliberate, until Olivia finally spoke, her voice low, measured, carrying no trace of fear. "You have done this before," she said, not as a question but as a simple observation, and the words settled into the car like weight, and Reeves let out a short breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh. "I follow procedure," he replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, and Olivia did not respond right away. She simply watched the passing lights reflect across the glass, across the edges of the dashboard, across the faint outline of the man who believed he was still in control. And when she spoke again, her tone did not rise, did not challenge, it only revealed. Procedure does not look at the camera before it acts. And that was when Reeves's grip tightened again, just enough for his knuckles to pale under the dim interior light. And for the first time since the stop began, a small crack formed in the certainty he had built around himself, a quiet realization that something about this moment was not unfolding the way it should, not following the script he had written in his mind. And the patrol car continued down the road, cutting through the night, carrying both of them toward a destination that suddenly felt less predictable, less controlled, as if somewhere between the flashing lights and the silent lens of that camera, the story had already begun to change, and neither of them would leave it the same. The patrol car rolled into the precinct lot under a wash of pale overhead lights that flattened everything into sharp edges and long shadows. And as the engine cut off, the sudden silence pressed in, heavy and expectant, while Officer Daniel Reeves sat for a brief second with both hands still on the wheel, staring forward as if the night outside had something left to explain. But it did not. It only waited. And behind him, Olivia Carter remained perfectly still, her reflection faint in the divider glass, her eyes clear and focused, not on him now, but on the space beyond, as if she could already see the next room, the next step, the next consequence. And Reeves exhaled slowly before stepping out, the door opening with a firm click that echoed across the quiet lot, his posture returning to its practiced shape as he walked around to the back, each movement deliberate, controlled, reclaiming the rhythm he trusted. And when he opened her door, the fluorescent light spilled across her face, cool and unforgiving. Yet she did not squint, did not hesitate. She simply stepped out, heels touching concrete with the same quiet precision as before, and for a moment they stood facing the building, its glass doors reflecting them both back in distorted fragments. Officer and detainee, authority and accusation. But the balance between them no longer felt as simple as it looked. And inside the station the air carried a different weight, a low hum of voices, ringing phones, the distant clatter of keyboards, all blending into a constant rhythm that swallowed individual moments whole. And as they walked and heads turned, conversation slowed, a ripple moving through the room as recognition sparked, first uncertain, then sharp, and someone near the front desk leaned closer to another officer, whispering just loud enough to carry, "That is her." And the words spread quickly, not shouted but felt, passing from one glance to another. And Reeves kept moving, guiding Olivia toward the processing area, his hand hovering near her arm without touching, maintaining the appearance of procedure. But the air around them had shifted, no longer routine, no longer controlled, and Olivia felt it too. The change in energy, the subtle fracture in certainty. Yet her expression did not change. Her shoulders remained steady, her breathing even. And when they reached the desk, the clerk hesitated, fingers pausing above the keyboard, eyes flicking between Reeves and Olivia as if trying to reconcile two conflicting realities. And Reeves cleared his throat. "Firm. Processing," he said, placing the report down with a measured motion. And the clerk nodded slowly, beginning to type, the sound of keys striking filling the brief silence, each entry locking the moment further into record, into system, into something that could not be easily undone. But as the information appeared on the screen, the clerk's posture shifted again, a subtle stiffness, a glance toward the monitor, then back at Olivia, and then toward Reeves, uncertainty creeping in where routine should have been, and Olivia noticed every detail, every hesitation, every glance, storing it, understanding it, and when the clerk finally spoke, voice quieter than before, Judge Carter. The name landed softly, but it carried weight. And for the first time since they entered the building, Reeves felt it fully. The shift, the recognition, the reality pressing against the version of events he had built, and he straightened slightly, jaw tightening, as if posture alone could hold the narrative together. But the room was no longer fully his. The glances had changed. The silence had meaning now. And somewhere in the background, a supervisor stepped out of an office, drawn by the shift in tone, drawn by something unspoken yet undeniable. And Olivia stood there, still composed, still calm, her presence filling the space without force, without resistance, simply by existing exactly as she was. And as the seconds stretched and the weight of the moment settled deeper into the room, it became clear that whatever had begun out on that street had not followed them inside unchanged. It had grown, it had taken shape, and it was no longer something that could be quietly processed and filed away. It was something that demanded to be seen, to be questioned, to be understood, and whether Reeves was ready or not, the story had moved beyond him. The room did not return to normal after her name was spoken. It only grew quieter in a different way, the kind of quiet that carried attention instead of routine, and the supervisor who had stepped out now moved closer, his footsteps measured, his eyes moving from the screen to Olivia Carter and then to Officer Daniel Reeves, trying to read a situation that no longer fit neatly into procedure. And Reeves felt that shift press against him again, subtle but persistent, like something loosening beneath his control. Yet he kept his stance firm, shoulders squared, hands resting near his belt as if posture alone could anchor the narrative. And the supervisor stopped at the desk, glancing briefly at the report before looking directly at Olivia. Judge Carter, he said, slower this time, as if confirming it aloud made it more real, and Olivia inclined her head slightly, not in submission but acknowledgement, her gaze steady, calm, unchanged, and for a moment no one spoke, the low hum of the station filling the gap, phones ringing somewhere in the distance, a printer feeding out paper in a slow, mechanical rhythm. And then the supervisor shifted his attention to Reeves. Walk me through it, he said, tone even but no longer casual, and Reeves responded without hesitation, his words structured, precise, each detail placed exactly where it needed to be: traffic stop, probable cause, discovery, arrest. The sequence delivered like a practice script, but as he spoke the room did not settle, the tension did not release. Instead it lingered, hanging between each sentence, because something about the scene in front of them did not align with the version being told, and Olivia stood there through all of it, silent, composed, her presence quietly contradicting the story, without saying a single word. And when Reeves finished there was another pause, longer this time. And the supervisor looked back at the monitor, scanning the entry, then at the evidence bag resting in its container, then at Olivia again, and finally he asked, body cam? And Reeves nodded once, quick, controlled, active during the stop, he replied, but the answer did not land the way he expected. Instead it shifted the room again, drawing attention to something unseen yet suddenly important. And Olivia's eyes moved slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question, just enough to confirm what she already knew, and the supervisor picked up a phone, dialing without urgency but with intent, requesting the footage, his voice low, procedural, yet the act itself changed everything, turning the moment from assumption to verification, from narrative to record. And Reeves felt it then, more clearly than before, a faint tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but awareness. The recognition that the next step did not belong entirely to him anymore, that something external, something impartial, was about to enter the story, and the seconds stretched as they waited, the station continuing its quiet rhythm around them. But inside that small space near the desk time seemed to slow, each glance, each breath carrying more weight than before, and Olivia remained exactly as she had been since the beginning, calm, steady, unshaken, her gaze drifting once more toward the ceiling where another camera watched silently, another lens recording, another witness that could not be persuaded or redirected. And as the supervisor ended the call and set the phone down, his expression unreadable but focused, it became clear that the moment of simple processing had passed, replaced by something else entirely, something that would not be resolved by routine or paperwork, something that required truth to surface whether anyone was ready for it or not. And in that quiet shift, before the footage even arrived, the balance in the room tilted just enough for everyone to feel it, even if no one had said it out loud. The wait stretched longer than anyone expected, not because of delay, but because of what it carried, the quiet anticipation settling over the room like a pressure that no one could ignore. And when the email notification finally chimed from the supervisor's computer, it sounded louder than it should have, sharp against the low hum of the station, drawing every nearby glance without a word being spoken. And the supervisor stepped closer to the monitor, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk as he opened the file, the screen flickering once before stabilizing into the grainy still frame of a parked patrol car under streetlights. And for a brief second nothing moved, no one spoke, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not be easily undone. And Officer Daniel Reeves stood a few feet away, posture still firm but no longer effortless, his eyes fixed on the screen with a focus that bordered on tension, while Olivia Carter remained exactly where she had been, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her gaze steady but not urgent, as though she had already seen what they were about to witness. And the supervisor pressed play. And the footage began to move, slow at first, capturing the quiet of the street, the flashing lights, the open door, the familiar setup of a routine stop. And Reeves's voice came through the speakers, controlled, authoritative, repeating the same words he had just spoken moments ago. But now they existed outside of him, separate, recorded, unable to be adjusted or reshaped, and the room leaned in without realizing it, attention narrowing to the screen as the sequence unfolded. And for several seconds, everything aligned, every motion, every step, reinforcing the version of events that had been presented. And then the angle shifted slightly as the camera adjusted to movement, capturing a moment that had passed unnoticed before, a small detail, almost insignificant, but now isolated, undeniable. And the supervisor's hand stilled on the desk as the frame revealed Reeves's arm moving in a way that did not match his report, a pause that did not belong, a placement that had no explanation within the story he had told. And the footage did not rush past it. It held it, recorded it, preserved it with quiet precision, and the room changed in that instant, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, the kind of shift that moves beneath the surface and alters everything at once. And Reeves felt it before anyone spoke, a tightening across his chest, a sudden awareness that the space around him no longer felt aligned, that the control he had relied on was no longer absolute. And he took a small step forward, as if proximity could influence what was already fixed on the screen, but it did not change. It only continued, the sequence unfolding with calm certainty, showing what it showed, without hesitation or interpretation. And someone near the desk let out a quiet breath, almost involuntary, and the supervisor did not look away, his eyes tracking every second, every frame, until the clip reached the point of arrest. And then he paused it, the image freezing on the screen with a clarity that left no room for confusion. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything before, not empty but full, filled with understanding, with implication, with the weight of a truth that had surfaced without being forced. And slowly the supervisor turned his head, not toward Olivia, not toward the room, but toward Reeves. And the look in his eyes was no longer questioning, no longer uncertain. It was measured, deliberate, and grounded in what he had just seen. And Olivia stood there, unchanged, her presence steady, her silence more powerful now than any words could have been. And in that moment it became clear to everyone in the room that the story had already moved beyond explanation, beyond control, and whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption, but by what had been revealed in plain view. No one moved after the frame froze, the image still glowing on the screen like something that refused to be ignored, and the hum of the station seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a silence that carried weight, the kind that settles into your chest before your mind fully catches up. And Officer Daniel Reeves stood there, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, but held together by habit, his eyes fixed on the frozen moment that had already slipped beyond his control, and the supervisor kept his gaze steady, not raising his voice, not reacting outwardly. But the shift in his presence was unmistakable. It was no longer about procedure. It was about accountability. And slowly he reached forward and replayed the clip, not for the room, not for confirmation, but because truth demands repetition when it first surfaces. And again the movement appeared, clear, precise, undeniable, and this time no one looked away, not even Reeves, because looking away would not change what had already been recorded. And Olivia Carter stood quietly beside the desk, her hands still, her expression composed. But there was something different now. Not relief, not triumph, but a quiet recognition that the moment had arrived exactly as it needed to. And the supervisor paused the footage again and finally spoke, his voice measured, controlled. "Do you want to explain that?" he said, not loudly, not accusingly, but with a firmness that left no space for deflection. And Reeves swallowed once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before shifting his stance, his mind, moving quickly, searching for structure, for a way to rebuild what had begun to fracture. "It is not what it looks like," he said, but even as the words left his mouth they felt thinner than before, less certain, and the room did not respond the way it might have earlier. There were no nods, no automatic acceptance, only stillness, only attention, and Olivia's eyes moved briefly toward him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that made the space between them feel even wider. And she spoke for the first time since the footage had played, her voice calm, even. "The camera does not interpret, officer, it records." And the simplicity of the statement settled into the room with more force than any raised voice could have carried. And Reeves's jaw tightened, his shoulders lifting slightly, as if resisting something unseen. But there was no argument for what had been shown, no way to reposition the sequence into something else. And the supervisor exhaled slowly, turning his attention away from the screen and toward the process that now had to follow, his hand reaching for another phone, another step, another layer of authority that would move this beyond the walls of the station. And the sound of dialing filled the silence again, steady, deliberate, each tone marking the progression of something that could not be undone. And around them the station began to breathe again, quiet conversations restarting in low tones. But the energy had changed, no longer curious, no longer speculative, now grounded in the understanding that what had seemed like a routine moment had become something far more serious, something that would not be contained. And Olivia stood exactly as she had from the beginning, steady, present, her gaze no longer fixed on any one point, but carrying a quiet awareness of everything unfolding. And as the supervisor began to speak into the phone, his words precise, his tone formal, it became clear that the next phase had already begun, not driven by assumption or authority, but by the simple, unchangeable presence of truth. And in that moment, without any need for raised voices or dramatic gestures, the balance that had once favored control had shifted completely, leaving only what could be proven, what could be seen, and what could no longer be denied. The call ended with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and the supervisor lowered the phone slowly, his expression no longer neutral but resolved, as if a line had been crossed that could not be stepped back over. And the room adjusted around that realization. Officers who had once stood casually now held themselves with quiet awareness. Conversations reduced to low murmurs that carried more weight than noise. And Officer Daniel Reeves remained where he was, but the space around him had shifted in a way that could not be ignored, no longer centered, no longer supported by assumption. And he glanced once toward the screen again, as if searching for something he had missed, something that might change what had already been seen. But the frozen frame remained exactly the same, steady, unyielding, and Olivia Carter watched none of it directly, her gaze resting instead somewhere just beyond the room, as if she understood that the most important part of this moment was not the reaction but what would follow. And the supervisor stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying a new authority. "Internal affairs is on the way," he said, each word landing with quiet finality. And that was when the shift became complete, not sudden, not loud, but absolute, because those words did not accuse, they did not argue. They simply moved the situation into a space where truth would be examined without bias, without assumption, without protection, and Reeves felt it settle into him. A weight that could not be redirected, and for the first time his posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the strain beneath the surface, his shoulders lowering slightly, his stance no longer anchored in certainty, but held in place by the absence of it. And he looked toward Olivia then, not with defiance, not with confidence, but with something quieter, something closer to realization, and she met his gaze without resistance, without triumph, only with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning. And in that silent exchange there was no need for words, because everything that needed to be understood was already present between them, and around them the station continued to function. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, but none of it felt the same, because everyone in that space knew they were witnessing a moment that would extend far beyond the walls of the building, a moment that would be reviewed, documented, questioned, and remembered. And as the distant sound of a car pulling into the lot reached the room, subtle but distinct, the supervisor straightened slightly, his attention shifting toward the entrance, and the energy in the space tightened once more, not with uncertainty now, but with anticipation, because the next step was arriving. And Olivia remained still, her breathing even, her presence grounded, as if she had never doubted this moment would come, and Reeves stood in place, no longer directing the scene but existing within it, waiting. And when the door at the far end opened and new figures stepped inside, carrying with them the quiet authority of process and accountability, the final piece fell into place, not with force, not with spectacle, but with the simple, undeniable progression of truth moving forward. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, the story turned completely, leaving behind what had been assumed and stepping fully into what could no longer be denied. The door closed softly behind the internal affairs officers, but the presence they brought with them changed the air immediately, not through volume or force, but through precision, through the quiet certainty of people who did not need to raise their voices to be heard. And they moved with calm efficiency, one stepping toward the supervisor, exchanging a few low words while the other's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every posture, every silence that had already begun to tell its own version of the story. And Officer Daniel Reeves felt that attention settle on him like weight, not sudden, not aggressive, but undeniable. And for the first time since the night began, he did not move to adjust it, did not step forward to reclaim control. He simply stood there, aware that the narrative no longer belonged to him. And the supervisor gestured toward the screen, the frozen frame still visible. And without hesitation the footage was replayed once more, this time not as discovery but as evidence, each second carrying a different gravity. And the internal affairs officer watched closely, his expression unchanged, his focus exact. And when the moment came, the same moment that had shifted the room before, he did not react outwardly. He only nodded once, as if confirming something that required no interpretation, and the video ended, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt uncertain. It felt defined, and he turned toward Reeves, his voice steady, formal. "We need to speak with you," he said, not as a request, but as a step already in motion, and Reeves nodded slowly, the movement measured, controlled, but lacking the confidence it once held. And as he followed them a few steps away from the desk, the distance felt larger than it was, as if each foot of space marked the separation between what had been assumed and what had now been established. And Olivia Carter remained where she was, her hands now free, the metal no longer resting against her wrists, though no one had made a spectacle of its removal. It had happened quietly, appropriately, as procedure corrected itself, and she lowered her hands gently, flexing her fingers once, not out of discomfort, but as a simple acknowledgement of the moment passing. And her gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not claiming, only observing, taking in the shift that had unfolded exactly as truth tends to unfold, without force, without urgency, simply by being seen. And near the desk the supervisor closed the report file, setting it aside with a deliberate motion that signaled its irrelevance in its current form. And around them the station resumed its rhythm again, but it was different now, grounded, aware, as if every sound carried the memory of what had just occurred. and across the room Reeves stood with the internal affairs officers, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders lowered slightly, his expression no longer guarded but reflective, as if he were finally seeing the full shape of what had begun hours earlier. And though no raised voices filled the space, no dramatic confrontation unfolded, the shift was complete, clear to everyone present, because the authority that once seemed absolute had been replaced by something far more powerful, something that did not depend on position or assumption, something that existed independently of both. And Olivia stood quietly within that truth, not elevated by it, not defined by it, but aligned with it, as she had been from the very beginning. And as the internal affairs officer spoke again, outlining the next steps in a tone that left no room for deviation, it became clear that the story was no longer about what had happened on the street. It was about what would follow, what would be examined, what would be recorded, and what would ultimately remain when everything else had been stripped away. And in that quiet, steady progression, without spectacle or noise, the final weight of the moment settled fully into place. Morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of the courthouse, soft and steady, casting long reflections across the polished marble floor as Olivia Carter stepped forward with measured calm, her heels echoing lightly in the quiet hallway, each step grounded, unhurried, as if the weight of the previous night had already settled into something distant, something resolved. And outside the courtroom doors a few people stood waiting, their voices low, their expressions carrying a mix of curiosity and recognition. But when she passed them, she did not slow, did not acknowledge the attention. Her focus fixed ahead, steady, clear. And inside the courtroom the air felt different, not tense, not heavy, but precise, like everything in that space existed exactly where it was meant to be. And she moved toward the bench, her robe falling into place with quiet familiarity, the fabric catching the light as she took her seat. And for a moment there was only stillness, the kind that does not demand silence but creates it. And then the room settled, people seated, papers adjusted, the rhythm of order returning. And somewhere in the background a case was called, routine continuing as it always did. But beneath that routine there was something unspoken, something carried forward from the night before, something that had shifted more than a single moment. And as proceedings began, Olivia's voice filled the room, calm, measured, unchanged, delivering each word with the same clarity she had always held, not elevated by what had happened, not hardened by it, simply aligned with the responsibility she carried. And beyond the walls of the courtroom the city moved on, traffic flowing, conversations rising and falling, headlines forming and fading. But within this space the focus remained on something quieter, something more enduring. And later, when the session ended and the room gradually emptied, Olivia remained seated for a brief moment, her hands resting lightly on the bench, her gaze lowered just enough to catch the reflection of light across its surface. And she exhaled slowly, not from relief, not from exhaustion, but from recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that had passed exactly as it needed to. And as she stood and stepped down from the bench, her fingers brushed briefly against the engraved nameplate,